Let's get going here. I'm David Ray, class of '78. I'm just here as the wingman. I have no role other than to say that, I mean, every class, everybody, every alum here has an own amazing class with its own amazing stories. We are particularly fortunate to have one of the most amazing stories with a truly most amazing classmate in Mickey Berdy. And I'll just stop there and, you know.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself at first, because it turned out that the class of 1978 sort of had no idea who I was, which is actually kind of understandable. I started off at Smith. My first year at Smith, I was all over the place, didn't know what I was doing. Convinced my long-suffering parents to let me take a year off, came back, was very into Russian. I had taken a little bit of Russian in high school, and now I was all about Russian. And I had the very good fortune to come over to Amherst and take some classes here in Russian. And I honestly believe that the Russian department at Amherst College was absolutely, and probably still is absolutely, the best in the country. And it just was, it was like a revelation. And at the end of that year, Amherst decided to go co-ed. But you had to, if you transferred, you had to be here for 2 years. And it was the end of my sophomore year, and I couldn't apply until the next year. So again, cue to long-suffering parents. I talked them into letting me take another year off. I talked them into letting me be a part-time student at Connecticut College because I was already interested in translation, didn't know anything about it, and there was a professor there who was going to help me. Applied to Amherst, came to Amherst, and by that time I was 2 years older than everybody else in my class. I had a boyfriend in New York, I lived off campus, and I just came to Amherst and went to school. So that's why nobody knows who I am here. And at the end of that, I went to Russia and kind of stayed there from 1978 until March 9th, 2022. Not quite. I mean, I did spend a little bit of time in the States during that time. But I went over first to study at the Pushkin Institute because Russian is a difficult language. And I could, read 19th century poetry very well. And I had no idea what people were saying to me on the street very quickly. So I spent a semester at the Pushkin Institute, and then I wanted to stay. So again, cue long-suffering parents. There were publishing houses, 3 Soviet publishing houses who hired foreigners. And I got hired by Agentstvo Pechati Novosti, APN. With that, my parents did insist that I go to the American embassy and make sure that I could do this and I wouldn't lose my citizenship or something like that. And I spent about 3 years working as an editor. They called us stylists, as if we were hairdressers. Editing articles for Soviet Woman, Soviet Union, and for these diplomatic kind of posts that they got ready every morning. And I learned, an awful lot about the Soviet Union. The sort of joke line, we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us, was kind of true. I came in, they gave me my editing, and I wanted to be like the American. You got to do more than you're asked to do. So I kept doing more and more and more, and then finally somebody pulled me aside and said I was ruining the entire system. that I had this quota of 25 pages, and if I did more, it threw off everybody else. It threw off the translators, it threw off the editors after me. So I worked the Soviet way. You come in the morning, you make a cup of coffee, you go out and have a cigarette, you come back, you do a little bit of work, another time for a cigarette break, do a little bit more work, then it's lunchtime. You divide up the lunchtime food runs. So one person would go to the dairy store and buy whatever was there for everybody else. One person would go to the bread store, and so on. You come back, but then you haven't eaten, so you have to sit at your desk and eat your lunch. Then you have another cigarette. Then about 2 o'clock, sometimes at a place like APN, we had pretty good food in the cafeteria. So they would buy extra, or there was extra meat that would usually be for sale. So then you'd go downstairs and you'd stand in line for 45 minutes. And this was sacred. Nobody would ever, yell at you for this. And you would buy some kind of hunk of meat, have another cigarette, have some more coffee, do a little bit more work, and that was your day. Meanwhile, I kind of fell in with the people. Oh, and somebody asked me the other day about like the American, like the expat community. But there wasn't one. There were diplomats, there were correspondents, and there were a lot of correspondents. I mean, people in my class remember newspapers that had foreign correspondents, international sections. So there were all 3 U.S. networks. There were the wire services. There was Los Angeles Times, Baltimore Sun, Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, and I think a 5th one I can never remember. And then I knew there was like one other American working for a publishing house and a couple of Brits, and that was it. I mean, there really wasn't an expat community at all. And the people who could hang around with us were the sort of half dissident and sometimes complete dissident people. So I, fell into this wonderful crowd of musicians and artists and writers. The difficult part in those years was you were kind of a ticket out of the country for somebody. So you always had people wanting to marry you so that you would take them out. In the end, cue to long-suffering parents, I did get married, although it was for a good reason. But he was a sort of dissident rock star. My parents really went through a lot with me, but somehow managed to get through it all. And I stayed, I guess, that time until just before Brezhnev died. And that's how you sort of mark time, 1982. Spent several years in the States and kind of back and forth again. I had started translating. I turned out to be, have no trouble doing consecutive interpreting. And I owe part of my career to Boris Yeltsin, who in 1989 came to the United States, and I had been hired to work on a series of shows that was called Inside Gorbachev's USSR. That was kind of a big deal at the time. And they were going to interview Yeltsin, the producers, and they wanted me to translate. So I was sitting in the other room with the producer who didn't speak Russian, earphones on, and I said, I don't know how to do simultaneous. I'm just going to do, give you the gist of it. I put on the earphones and I did an hour of simultaneous interpreting. Had no idea how that worked. And I continued to do that on and off for almost about 10 years, working with film crews, doing you were called associate producer. Actually, you were just the lowest dog's body doing sort of, all the organizational stuff. But I would do interpreting when we would do interviews. Now, the way they do this in the real world, because it's so stressful on your brain, is you sit in a booth and you do it for 30 minutes. I would do it for like 3 hours. And because the reason you kind of sit in a booth is so that you're not distracted. You're just sort of sitting there half in the dark. And in film crews, you go to somebody's apartment and there would be wires and techies and people running all over the place. And it was driving me crazy. So we had the idea of the interpretation blanket. And I would sit in a hallway, and they would cover me with a blanket. And I would have the earphones on and a mic so that the people shooting, would hear what he was saying. And I would sit, and there would be this sort of lump, this talking blanket lump, And it would go on. And I got to the point where while I was interpreting like Gennady Burbulis or something for 3 hours, I could make notes in Russian, like, call the restaurant, we're going to be late, and I would like hold it out under the blanket and wave it around. And that's really not good for your brain. Whatever I was doing was really not good for my brain. So I eventually stopped that. I never had any interest in learning anything about doing professional simultaneous interpreting. I moved completely back to Russia. I had apartments in Brooklyn and Moscow for a while, and I moved back after 1991 when it was kind of a free-for-all. Everybody just got, you paid $50 and you got a business visa. I moved back with 2 cats, 7 pieces of luggage. Nobody opened anything. It was very easy and kind of wild in those years. Worked in television, then worked in health communication, sort of led into health communication, all kinds of grant organizations there, lots of health problems, no ability to tell patients and the population what you should do if you think you might have tuberculosis or why breastfeeding is good, that kind of thing. So I worked in that field for about 10 years. All the time, I was doing lots of translation and a fair amount of writing, wrote a couple of guidebooks. And in 2002, the Moscow Times, which was founded by Dirk Sauer as an expat newspaper, again, the world before internet, a bunch of expats in the 90s, companies moved to Moscow, but they needed news. So the Moscow Times had an international news section. We did, a stock section. We did sports, of all things, as well as covering news in Russia and in Moscow. It was very successful. It was the only place that had advertising. There were restaurants that were opening up, and they had no idea how to let people know that they existed. And they had a column called The Wordsworth, which was about Russian language. And there had been 2 people who had done it. And in 2002, somebody had left. And I thought, well, I could do that. So I was hired on probation. And I had been writing this column on Russian grammar and translation in the Russian language for 21 years now, which to me is sort of remarkable because it's a column about Russian grammar, of all things. And I also did other writing for the Moscow Times. And since 2015, I've been the arts editor, which is kind of the best job in the world, particularly because over that time period, life got sort of more and more comfortable and more interesting and simply, people had more money, there were more shops. It was a normal lifestyle again. And the arts were actually booming. There was a period of people not really knowing what they wanted to do, a lot of sort of copying of Western films and theater. And then really it began to develop in its own way. And theater and opera and movies and museums, new little museums opened. Curators began to really look at the past and discover all kinds of artists and all kinds of works that had been forgotten or ignored or whatever. And it was a very, very exciting time. The line about all of this is that the deal that, the sort of deal with the devil over the last 23 years since Putin has been in power has been, we'll make your life better and you stay out of politics and let us do whatever we want to do. Which is sort of true, but I would say to some extent, the government did its job in raising the standard of living for people. And it left alone the arts for pretty much almost all of that time. But, it was a little bit like being frogs dumped in cold water that was slowly heating up. There was just a little bit of, this law was passed. To my shame, the first law that was passed on where you could demonstrate, where you could hold a demonstration, I made fun of it. It was like you have to go in the woods. It was, the first law was like not within 50 yards or 50 meters of a hospital or something. It just didn't seem that bad. It just seemed sort of ridiculous. But bit by bit, those rights got impinged upon, and there became less and less of them. But still, even until very recently, there were still thousands of non-commercial organizations. There was the main television channels had kind of been taken over by the state. One of the first things that happened is they got rid of NTV, which was an independent news station. But there were still plenty of other sources of information that weren't state organized. There were newspapers. There was Echo Moskvy, a radio station. There was TV Rain, which got pushed off stations, but still was available to people. And through all of that, there was an awful lot of protesting. And the protesting also, at first, was kind of allowed, and then it was constrained, but they weren't beating people up, and then they were sometimes arresting people. As even I looked this up in January of 2021, there were, when Navalny came back and then was put in jail, there were demonstrations in 198 cities of Russia and 95 foreign cities. A week later, in 121 cities and 65 foreign cities, well over 50,000 people. So it seemed, it seemed to all of us that there was kind of there was always the sort of mitigating factors. I also knew a lot of people who were very active in the protest movement. And one of my friends who had been in a psychiatric prison hospital in the Soviet time period because of his dissident activities, got involved in organizing demonstrations and going to protests. And he also had American citizenship because he'd gotten kicked out and then came back. And was able to get Russian citizenship. And he was detained 3 or 4 times, and he would always just say, he would show his American passport, speaking perfect Russian, and say, I'm not going to say anything unless you call the American consul. And they would say, get out of here. It's like, this is a pain, I'm not going to deal with you. And at one point when he was arrested, it was, again, a demonstration against corruption, and he was just standing there watching, and suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder, turned around, and there's a kid, they call them spacemen, these huge, sort of bubble-shaped helmets and lots of, equipment, all dressed in black. But the kid says to him in Russian, says in Russian, "Пойдемте, отец." Come with me, Father, which is like what you say in a village as a sign of respect. My friend has gray hair and thick sort of glasses, takes him to the bus, and he says, now I'm going to pretend to pat you down. So he sort of makes a show of patting him down. Victor gets on the bus, and then he says, I turn around and I realize everybody else there is like 12 years old. But they take them to the station, and the head of the precinct, he flashes his American passport again, but this time they're going to write him up. And the head of the precinct comes up to him and he says, you understand this is nothing personal, which is like, you're arresting me, but you're telling me that this is nothing personal. And then he said, maybe if I wasn't in uniform, I would have been out there with you today. So there was always because corruption is a problem for everybody. Even if you're a guy taking bribes, if they're not cleaning the city streets and your kids can't get to school, you're still very unhappy with that. So it seemed to a lot of us, and also Putin's old, and there is something wrong with his health, I think, that maybe we would kind of get through all of this. And then we didn't. And then, and then the war. With the war, I didn't think it would happen. Almost nobody did. And I still think the reason for that is because we are not sociopaths. And it doesn't occur to you that a country would invade a neighboring country that posed no threat to them and was doing nothing wrong. And at first, the Moscow Times thought, even though the Russian news had already started to be closed off, we thought that we were going to be okay and had plans to stay. About a week after it began, they passed a law on what we call the law on fakes. And it said that you cannot have fake news about the war, which would be essentially telling what was happening. You couldn't use the word war. You couldn't use the word invasion or invade. You could not say anything or do anything that would discredit the Russian military. And we still thought that this only had to do with Russian media. And on Friday, March 4th, it was passed, and Putin signed it into law just before midnight. That night, for some reason, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I went into my kitchen, and I turned on my cable TV, and CNN was already off. And I got on Twitter, and everybody was leaving. It was just like this list of people leaving. So I sat down, and I wrote a probably deranged letter to the head of the newspaper and said, we got to get out of here. And then I got into the administrative part of the site, and I just scrubbed it. I went through, and every war, invasion, anything I saw, I just took out of headlines. If I couldn't think at 4 o'clock in the morning, how to change the title, I would just pull the articles because I didn't know what was going to happen to us. And at that point, it was clear, okay, we have to get out of here. We closed down the Russian side of the site. The English side sort of was open, but we weren't really putting anything on it. And almost everybody was already getting out. We have a lot of young people at the Moscow Times, and their parents were like, got to get out of here. So the problem was, where was I going to go? You couldn't fly. By that point, you couldn't fly to the west because Europe was blocking all flights. You could fly to Bishkek or Istanbul. But I also had a dog. And she was a 13-year-old dog. Now she's a 14-year-old dog. And she's not a small dog. She's a medium-sized dog. I just couldn't figure out how I was going to do this. And I wanted to figure out how to drive, but I couldn't figure out how to do that by myself. So I started calling everybody. And eventually a friend who had moved to Riga said, I got it. It's a van. It's 90 euros for you, 100 rubles for your dog. She doesn't have to get in a cage. You go overnight. The one van drops you off at the Russian side of the border. The other van picks you up on the other side of the Estonian border. And then it's a quick jog. They take you to Riga. So I said, okay, packed a suitcase, left everything else I own in the world, suitcase, computer, and my dog. And it was about 15 hours, and I had my suitcase, and I had dog stuff, and there was a babushka who desperately wanted to pass on a suitcase of stuff to her grandchild in Riga, and I felt compelled to take that too. But I had practiced walking with all of this stuff in my apartment. The problem was, it was March, and it was actually minus 18 Celsius that night, which is like 0. And I hadn't taken into consideration that the expanse of this border zone was well over a mile. And it was covered with 7 inches of ice, sprinkled with sort of dirt and stuff. And dragging the suitcase with my dog, who was like, okay, 4 o'clock in the morning, this is really fun. That's what we're going to do. Now I realize, even though it took a really long time and there were booths and you'd hand your passport in and they shut the window, and then you'd see guys back there on computers doing stuff. And then the window would open and you'd go over and they'd say, were you in Turkey in 2013? Yes, I think I went there on vacation. And then the window would shut again and they would go back to their computers. Somehow, we all managed to get through that. Somehow, I dragged everything over to the Estonian side. The Estonians were not, I think, allowed to help me, but they were like, you could leave the bags there. They felt very sympathetic. And got to Riga, got an apartment. My friend helped me set up. Riga and Latvia have been really generous. It is a very convenient place for us, sort of for our sins, because the reason for that is because it was occupied by the Russian-speaking Soviet Union for 50 years. As a result of that, about half the population and the older population all speak Russian. So it's you just speak Russian with almost anybody in services. Everybody is both Russian-speaking and Latvian-speaking. And young people speak English. So it's very unusual to go to a foreign country and be able to at least communicate with virtually anybody there. And it is this hub of the Russian media. And there are BBC Russia is there, Washington Post is there, Canadian Broadcasting is there, Medusa is there. TV Rain was there for a while. They had sort of problems, sort of political problems. It is difficult. Relations between Latvia and Russia, and obviously Latvians and the Russian population is really fraught right now. But they have been sort of remarkably welcoming and helpful to all of us. In the meantime, we're still working. The way we work is odd. We have some correspondents who are still in Russia. If you read our newspaper, there are no bylines, largely. Sometimes the correspondents, the journalists, particularly the young ones, like to invent really clever pseudonyms. So sometimes you'll find some sort of very clever pseudonyms there. We also make a lot of phone calls, or through Messenger or WhatsApp or something like that. A lot of the work that all of us do are little news briefs based on what we read in the Russian press. So there's an awful lot of that. I am still the arts editor, although I don't really we're not covering the arts in Russia, obviously. That would be totally inappropriate. So it's more covering kind of arts in the diaspora more than anything else. And because Riga has a large Russian population, they have a Russian theater, and there are a lot of people who come there, a lot of performers and so forth who come. So it's a kind of interesting place in terms of the arts. It's not great, but everybody is doing this because after Evan Gershkovich was arrested, everybody is not, the foreign journalists are not working in Russia right now. Evan worked with us for 3 years before he moved to AFP and then Wall Street Journal. So we feel in particular very strongly about this and also feel like it's not a place where we can go right now, given the fact that he worked for the Moscow Times. All of that said, there are about 8 of us in Amsterdam, I guess Yerevan still, UK, and Riga. And we get between 30 and 50 million page views a month. And I think that's not much compared to, what BBC gets and stuff. I mean, there's an awful lot of interest. So even though it's not what the kind of journalism that we want to do, we're doing the best that we can. What is going to happen next? I don't know. We keep getting kind of everything wrong. Nobody thought that the Soviet Union would fall apart in 1991. Nobody thought that the war would start like this last year. It's hard to even want to make any kind of prediction. I am one of the people with a couple of my friends who just keeps thinking it's going to end very quickly because Russia's being destroyed and the wealth of the billionaires who are running the government is also being destroyed. But so far that's not happening. So I don't know. If I knew or I had any idea. But this is one case where it's actually interesting why analysts all over the world just keep getting this wrong, despite the fact that there is so much expertise. But for right now, nobody knows. I don't know. I am an American citizen. So I am considered by Russia to be a citizen of an unfriendly country. So I can't, if I sold my apartment, I can't take the money out of the country. There's a whole lot of limitations on what I can do. So luckily there is, the concept of man with a van is kind of universal, and I've been able to have some of my things brought from Moscow to Riga, but just clothing and some books and things that are innocuous. So I will try to do that and hope for the best. So this was not exactly what I expected, but it is what it is. And now you're brought up to date. And I'm trying to leave time for questions. And I have left lots of time for questions. So.
Please.
Yes.
What about the Prigozhin factor?
I have no idea. Yeah. Prigozhin, if you folks, have you all been sort of following this? I mean, it was called the Wagner Group, and it was kind of misidentified as being like a private military company. Of course, it wasn't a private military company. It was a state-financed private military company. And Prigozhin spent a lot of time in jail for theft and I don't know what else. And they're sort of monstrous fighters, and they have taken people who were in jail. That's the way, it's a get out of jail free card. And they are, and he is fighting with the Russian military, and nobody kind of knows if it's saying that they're doing a bad job, and they are doing a bad job. To tell you the truth, I'm not like a military analyst by any means, but this whole myth that the Soviet army was like this extraordinary place. It isn't. For one thing, everybody, there was so much corruption that the rations were marked. The use by date was like 2007. They were using open. The reason why the Ukrainian army was able to kill the commanders so quickly was because their military communication system didn't work, and they were using open cell phones. And so, it was just, they could be spotted, and the Ukrainians would just bomb them. It was just kind of extraordinary. So they're not doing a good job, and Prigozhin is, shouting about that. But whether or not that is part of the plan to goad the military, I don't know. I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. Yeah, straight back. Uh-huh.
Are you able to still maintain sources within the Russian government? And do they talk to you, or do they seem to have any sort of plan or view on what's going on, or are they just going on day to day?
I don't do that kind of reporting very much, so for me, no. But we do have a couple of reporters who are on the political beat, and they still do have their contacts. And Zhenya Albatz has her contacts, and they tell her things all the time. And it is my belief, in the Soviet period, and when I was working at APN, there wasn't a single soul who believed anything that they were writing or translating. I mean, even there were the kind of Komsomol people who made a sort of a show of it, but nobody believed a word of it. And I don't believe today that any of those people believe a word of the nonsense that they're spouting. They know better than we do, really, the mess that they have made. So some of them do share that with some reporters very carefully. But very carefully. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any intelligence that you know of around the recent bombing in Moscow? Was it Ukraine? Was it?
I don't know. There's a really funny. There's another group. No one really knows what happened in Moscow. The kind of guess is that it was Ukraine, kind of giving them the finger. That was just, having a drone hit inside the Kremlin. It's kind of irresistible. But there's another group, and this is like the worst case scenario. The group that is attacking Russia, Belgorod, that part near Ukraine, is a Russian group, but they are like the neo-Nazis. They're like the super right wing, and some when I was joking about it, and it was pretending to be Putin. Yes, we have been attacked by Czech notes Russians who have attacked the Czech notes Russian town of Belgorod. That is, I don't know what's going to happen with that. That, I think, is just sort of almost like an annoyance thing. I don't know. But all of that, through all of this, for Russians, it just had nothing to do with them almost. It was like something was happening someplace else. And suddenly, particularly the recent drone attacks, they were on this area called Rublovka, which is where that sort of rich, sort of suburban area. And that is, again, that is incredibly annoying and embarrassing. But who exactly is doing it? I don't know. Yeah.
I have a question.
seems, I mean, the Ukrainians are winning on the battlefield, but you read a lot about how, despite all the sanctions, you have China, you have Turkey, you have Brazil, you have a number of countries, India, that have made their deal with the devil, so to speak, and they've got a lot of wealth because the oil prices have come up. And one hopes this will lead to the fall of Putin. Kiev will be his Stalingrad, so to speak. But you said that wealth is being destroyed, and Russia's and the wealthy oligarchs are. What is the evidence of that? Does that indicate that there might be a split in the ability to drive Putin out because their interests are threatened? Because I haven't really heard, I'm not saying you're wrong, but how is the wealth being destroyed?
Well, the wealth is being destroyed because for one thing, all the sanctions. People lost all of their yachts and property and things like that. I think also, but it isn't very clear. It isn't very clear within Russia exactly what pressure is being exerted by those people. The assumption is that, on the one hand, not very much because it puts you in a great deal of danger. On the other hand, these people aren't stupid and they must be figuring out something. There must be a plan B and a plan C. I don't know.
But the country is losing wealth?
Yeah, of course. I mean, yes. And one thing I was able to sell, and again, there are always problems, and in Russia you learn very quickly how to get around every problem. And so I keep thinking I'll figure that out with my apartment. With my car, I owned a lot of cars. My favorite was my Niva, this terrible kind of Jeep-like car that I love dearly. And I had a car, and suddenly they passed a law that if you had 3 or more administrative violations, if you were a foreigner, you could be deported and not given a visa. And an administrative violation would include if you had paid for parking and it ran out and you didn't get there on time, So you could have like 12 administrative violations in the course of a day if it was like a bad driving day in Moscow. But for some bizarre reason, they were kind of attached to the car and not the driver. So all the foreigners switched registration to a Russian friend. So I would still drive the car, and it was my car, but it wasn't registered to me. So part of the problem, the reason why I couldn't drive out of the country, was I couldn't figure out, it's not my car now, So it was like, well, that was clever, but at like 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to be going through like some border in Murmansk or something like that and trying to prove that I have the right to drive this car. Don't want to do that. And it was an old Hyundai Getz. It was a 2008 Hyundai Getz. And I thought I could maybe sell it for like a couple $1,000s. And I sold it for like $6,000. They sold it for me. And the reason why is because last year they built 25,000 cars in all of Russia because they don't have, what do you call them? They don't have the sanctions are on the... No, it's all of the chips, all the sort of, so they can't. So now when you look at the description of these cars, they don't have like the inflatable pillows and stuff like that. They're like 39, cars again. So suddenly my ancient, Hyundai Getz was actually worth a fair amount of money. Right now, yes, a lot of countries like India and China stepped in. Even before I left, my neighbors were calling me and saying, buy all of the dog kibble, all of the imported dog kibble, because it's going to disappear. And everybody just spent 3 weeks going around Moscow and buying up all the foreign medicines that they use because they're afraid it wouldn't be there anymore. But China, I think, has stepped up in there, and India has sort of compensated for that. But really, there isn't. They have lost a lot of money from their imports, and they're not producing things. There was this other problem. It turned out two things. One is they weren't making paper anymore. They were importing all of their paper from Finland. So that as soon as the war started, everybody bought up all the finished paper that existed, and they had to refit factories to make paper, but they couldn't buy the bleach. So it was that gray Soviet paper again. It was this awful stuff. And another thing, sorry, but feminine hygiene products were not made locally. So everybody just bought everything up. And I think India and China are kind of trying to make up for that, but I'm not sure. So I think in terms, it has survived, I think, better than we expected. But overall, they're not doing all that well. They're not doing well. Yeah.
How were you physically able to get out of Russia?
How did we drove through the border, and I had. Well, it was a service that arranged. It was mostly for people who had animals. And it was kind of a shuttle service, and so I had my dog, and there were two other dogs. One of them, a very ill-tempered French bulldog named Frosia, which is funny. It's like Bessie. It's like a cow name, and she kept trying to bite my dog, and my dog was shaking. And the little girl that was traveling. I think they were breeders. And they would take these dogs out through Riga and into Europe. And it was just a service that was arranged. And that was okay. And that was right after, that was March 9th, the night of March 9th, March 10th of last year. And even though it took a long time, the questioning wasn't as bad as it got later for people. And they checked everything, but it was more cursory than it got to be later. Yeah. Yeah.
I started working for U.S. News in 1985, and a year or two later, Nick Daniloff, who was
Yeah.
a Moscow correspondent,
Yeah.
taken into prison.
We did an interview with him recently in the Moscow Times because.
We mounted this big publicity campaign where we had free Nick Daniloff T-shirts handed out to all the staff.
Yeah.
But he was able to come back
Soon.
relatively quickly.
Yeah. Evan isn't going to come back that quickly. Yeah.
It doesn't appear to be happening with Evan.
Yeah.
Is that really, you think, just a reflection of Putin and his sort of...
Nobody knows if they have an idea of somebody they want to trade, if that's the idea, or if it was just or if it was, too much information is getting through on how badly we're doing, so we need to pump up the America as enemy line. So here's this guy, and we're going to say he's a spy, and how dare he? I mean, it's ridiculous. When you get accredited, you get checked by the FSB, and then you get checked by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They know exactly everything about us. I mean, and in fact, because I would just get visas every year, at the Moscow Times, when they would bring in my documents, the woman would go, "Oh, Michelka," because she's like, they did me every year, so they know exactly who you are. Nobody knows. I think the Wall Street Journal is doing a great job of plastering Evan all over the place and really trying to do that. I've written him and he wrote back to us, so that's good. I sent pictures of my dog. I don't know if he got those yet. We'll find out. Yeah.
So, more spoken more confident, I feel as you've been talking, the more confident I've been that I've heard you before. Did you speak on a podcast a couple of years ago about your
that wasn't me. That was about, the question was about if I'd spoken on a podcast about Victor Tsoi. That was Joanne Stingray. So I didn't, I was married to the generation before that of rock musicians. And, you know, if you all know, you know, Grodzki and that whole, Sasha Grodzki, who passed away last year. There's a group called Skamarokhi. Anyway, these were like the very first, you know, people who were able to do. In fact, my husband's, he was the bass guitarist, and they didn't know what to call him in his workbook, so he was like waiter in the choir or something like that, where they come up with sort of things. I think all of that period, you know, a lot of it was kind of derivative and a lot of it really wasn't derivative. And I think it's kind of a, you know, maybe this is the old rocker in me, but, you know, I think a lot of it was kind of underestimated. Yeah, it wasn't as sophisticated because they were making it up, you know, and they really didn't have access to what was going on in the rest of the world, or had very little access. So I think it was, you know, I think it was pretty good. Right now, with the arts, they didn't touch them for a really long time. You know, the first time they went after people, the first time it was Kirill Serebrennikov. But even that was, you know, sort of vegetarian, as they say. And when the war started, they didn't touch them also immediately. And then it just now everything's being sort of, you know, plays being taken out of production, theaters being closed, directors being kicked out. Now it's just, there's almost nothing of interest. I've already, yes, gentleman here.
Just back to Evan. He had the same information you had when in March 9th chose to stay.
No, everybody left. Almost everybody left. And then they started like drifting back to test. Oh. And at first, nobody got in trouble. And in fact, he was the first one who really got in trouble. And then everybody left again. And in the big companies, it's because they don't want the liability, obviously. In the small companies, just because, you know, there's no way. Once this happens, that's it. There's almost nothing you can do about it.
And I guess to follow up, are there Americans besides in the diplomatic corps still in
Yeah.
Moscow? And aren't they just sort of offering themselves up as hostages now for, you know, any
They're very careful. I mean, I am sympathetic because, I mean, if I hadn't been working for the Moscow Times, you know, I might have been one of those people, because there are a bunch of people who have lived there, you know, for 25 years. They teach English or they do something, and they really don't have a place to go. I mean, I'm kind of lucky that I was able to figure something out. So there are some people like that, and they keep a very low profile, and they're very, very careful. And and nobody knows. Yeah. Yes.
How secure is Putin's control of the military? Are there potential factions that could overthrow Putin?
I have absolutely no idea, but my guess is yes, it has to be. I mean, these people are not stupid. And if we know the disaster, they know more about the disaster. And I can't imagine that they all just want to see their country completely go to hell in a handbasket, you know? But who that might be and how that might happen. I will go on record, I'd probably be wrong because I've been wrong about everything else that I've predicted, but I do think one morning we're going to wake up and there'll be an announcement that Vladimir Vladimirovich has either retired due to poor health or passed away in the night. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's going to happen, but I don't know, you know, when. Yes, gentleman here. Uh-huh.
Vladimir Putin might be the most talked about world leader, you know, amongst Americans. How would you describe how the average Russian thought about Vladimir Putin before the war, and has it changed much in the year?
You know, one of the things I am always adamant about, because because of my experience in the Soviet Union, where people absolutely knew what was going on and you just kept your mouth shut or sort of, yeah, it's all fine. Right now, if you were called up and somebody as a pollster is asking you questions, the last thing you're going to do is say, oh, I can't stand the guy. Everybody just... Zhenya Albatz always laughs about this. She has a twin sister. And her twin sister says when people call up, she says, Putin, I'm going to vote for Putin. Zhenya's like, how can you possibly do that? So I don't think we know. I really don't. There are some of my neighbors, when the war started, they were absolutely on board. Horrible, why Biden? Why doesn't Biden like us? All of this, those terrible anti-Semite, Nazis in Ukraine. Okay. And there were people who just, they live in villages or something and they just don't have access to any other information. But on the other hand, there's a lot of, things are going to be missing, and kids, or these young men from these villages, are being sent to their deaths, and eventually that's going to get through the society, But what will be the catalyst? As I said, 1991, nobody thought the Soviet Union was going to dissolve the way it did, I don't know. Is there? I think.
We got a couple more minutes.
Okay, yeah.
How much of the war is Putin and his ego, and how much of it do you think is the Communist Party?
Oh, I think it's Putin.
Yeah. And so, what is his relationship with the Communist Party?
None. No. The Communist Party is kind of out of things. They kind of exist, but there's United Russia or something, but. No. There's the United Russia Party that's kind of the party of Putin, but it is. I think if you go back to that bizarre essay that Putin wrote about the brotherhood of Russian and Ukrainian peoples and stuff like that, it was just this nutty, sort of mishmash of history, and. It's like he was going to Sabrats Rus, еще раз. He's going to bring together the Russian, the Slavic nations. There's something like weird about all of that, I think. What do I know, right? But I think there's some kind of messianic, weird something. Because it doesn't make, there's no, if you look at it from the military or economic or any political point of view, what they've done is stupid. It doesn't make any sense. So it has to be, there's something else, there's some other reason.
As you made the claim that it's the billionaires running the country, but I think it's Putin with his army is more likely running the billionaires, and the billionaires are in front. And so Putin is about, this is his ego, showing the world that he's the jerk, he's not being run by all the Americans. He's running the oligarchs, because only a bully like him could do this kind of work.
Well, yes, the oligarchs and it's the billionaires, the actual minister of this, that, and the other thing, those people are also billionaires. But right now, everybody is keeping their mouth shut. And it is certainly Putin, and I have come to the end of my ding, 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 I think. Anyway, thank you very much.